Held items have evolved a lot ever since they were introduced in Generation 2. So I'm going to do a tier list of 32 of what I think are the most notable items in competitive Pokemon. The reason there's only 32 is because some items have literally little to no relevancy in competitive Pokemon. My criteria for this tier list is basically how relevant and popular has this item been as a whole. So essentially, if an item was good but only on like 2 Pokemon back in Gen 3, then it's probably not going to get very high on this list. So, real quick, what do these stand for? S for a super sensational item, A for a really great item, B for barely missed the A tier, C for can you blame me for not putting this item in a higher tier, D for don't try to tell me this is a good item, and E for everything here is not very good. Okay, I'm kidding. But like, what do they actually stand for? The S tier is for amazing items that if it didn't exist, it would make a great shift in competitive Pokemon. A is an item that I would be surprised if your team didn't have at least one Pokemon with it. B is overall just a really great item. B is a good item. I would understand why you have it. Wouldn't necessarily be surprised if you didn't. C is an okay item. It's not bad. It's okay. D are items that aren't generally very useful, other from very specific situations, and everything below that is just not very good. So first off, Leftovers. It was introduced in Generation 2, the first generation where held items became a thing. Leftovers is an item with a very impressive resume. Honestly, even though it was introduced in 1999, it's just as valuable as it was back in Gen 2. Gen 2 was a notoriously slow-paced generation, and I can't help but think that Leftovers kind of added to that reason. Although competitive singles has changed a lot, one thing that has not changed is how important passive recovery is. It was a great item particularly in Gen 3 as a good way to combat chip damage from Sandstorm, and it was always Blissey's go-to item up until Gen 8. It's a great item, and without it, Pokemon, especially the earlier gens, would look much different. Up until Generation 8, I would say that it was the best item period. So it's going straight into the S tier. Next up is Heavy Duty Boots, the item that I alluded to when I said that Leftovers was no longer the best item. Heavy Duty Boots is an item that redefines singles, even more than Leftovers. You can see this in the fact that it was only introduced in Generation 8, and it already managed to help Pokemon of certain types be deemed more viable than before, just because of its mere existence. It's not uncommon to see teams composing of Pokemon who only run Heavy Duty Boots. In a game where Pokemon that are introduced are increasingly more powerful, it's important that teams have longevity to deal with those threats, and Heavy Duty Boots can offer that. This is an item that single-handedly made some moves less vital and one far more incredible, being Knockoff. That's not something that any item has ever been able to do. Not only is it a vital part of competitive Pokemon, but it's also slightly controversial, since it's overwhelmingly the go-to item. Singles is not like VGC, where there's an item restriction or an item clause. If you want to run a team with all Tims, you can do that. There are Pokemon that were primarily known as hazard setters that are now running sets without hazards because of this new item, like Ferrothorn. I'm not saying hazards are obsolete, let the record show, but now it's more common to see Ferrothorns run sets without spikes, and you just didn't see that pre-Heavy Duty Boots. So yeah, straight to the S tier. I would say it's the best item right now. Next is Megastones. Honestly, the concept of an item that changes literally everything about you, from typing to ability and stats, is amazing. So it goes straight to the S tier. And I know that it was not relevant for many generations, but I still think that it was incredibly significant, plus it'll be coming back. So it's going straight to the S tier. There's no other item that managed to take a Pokemon from a rank like RU or PU straight to Ubers or OU. So straight to the S tier. Next is Specs, Scarf, and Choice Band. I'm lumping these items in together because obviously they have different uses, but I feel like they have the same amount of relevancy. They were all introduced in Generation 4 and have been very relevant since then. There have been many items that used to have a lot of competitive relevancy but have fallen off, as we will discuss later, but these items are so consistent and will probably continue to be relevant forever. They're great items specifically because you get the boost as soon as you hit the field and don't need to spend a turn to set up, and you don't need to waste HP with other items like Life Orb. I think the addition of these items is one of the reasons Gen 4 is a very beloved meta. It adds a very fun element to the game, and you never know for sure if a Pokemon was holding one of these items. Scarf especially, I think, facilitated the role of the revenge killer and was able to make certain Pokemon more viable, because now you didn't need to risk a turn to set up, especially if your Pokemon of choice is pretty frail, like Infernape, Jolteon, or Starmie. The dropback can be pretty annoying, sure, but a 1.5 boost in 3 potential stats is pretty major, and ultimately it's okay for a game revolving around switching in. Honestly, it's not a huge drawback. So they're all going into A tier. The reason I'm not putting it in the S tier is because though I think it's close, I wouldn't say it's as meta defining as Heavy Duty Boots. Next is Assault Vest, an item introduced in Generation 6. Assault Vest is a little less iconic than the other choice counterparts, but still very good. Assault Vest raises the user's special defense by 1.5, but the user can only choose attacking moves. I actually have a lot of love for Assault Vest, and I feel like this item that overall needs more attention. It's less limiting because you can still choose any of your 4 moves, but of course only being able to choose attacking moves is somewhat annoying. Unlike the other choice items, Assault Vest is a little more niche since pretty much all offensively oriented Pokemon can benefit from an attack or speed boost, but not all need a special defense boost. And of course, it can seem a little counterintuitive since usually the Pokemon that you're going to invest in defensively are a little more stall oriented and will want to choose other moves other than attacking moves. Of course, that's not a hard and fast rule. So what kind of Pokemon would benefit from this item? Well, a pretty iconic user of Assault Vest is Magnera, a Pokemon with a great defensive typing of Steel Fairy and great offensive and defensive typings of 115 and 130. So essentially, Pokemon that would benefit is a Pokemon with great defensive potential. You want to tank hits, but you also want to exploit offensively. Of course, not all users of this need to follow that rule, like Assault Vest Toxapex didn't exactly fit that description, but still pretty similar. So yeah, it's been a little bit of a niche item, but great nevertheless. However, because it's a little niche, it hasn't had the same impact compared to the other choice items, so I'm going to put it in B. Next is Eviolite. Eviolite was introduced in Gen 5, and it's an item that when given to an evolved Pokemon, it raises its defense and special defense by 50%. Eviolite is, I think, the most interesting item I have on this list, because in OU, Eviolite hasn't exactly had the most success, with really the only successful Eviolite user being Chansey. Like in current OU, Eviolite has no relevancy at all, since the power level is way too high, even for that really good boost in defenses. But in the lower tiers, Eviolite is integral. For example, in Little Cup, pretty much all the Pokemon use Eviolite. In PU, the power level is so low that many unevolved Pokemon are viable, and of course many of them hold Eviolite, notable users being Ferroseed, Doublade, and Scyther and Clefairy. So that's why I was confused, because I was really only thinking about the tier list in the form of OU, but Eviolite has had such high relevancy in other tiers that I can't ignore. Honestly, the ability to make otherwise terrible Pokemon viable is really impressive. Not only that, but again, it's the most important item in Little Cup. So much of the tier kind of revolves around this item. It's so prominent that it's essentially a broken item. Everybody knows this, but they don't ban it because it would change the entire landscape of LC. So it's going to go in A, because any item that the tier revolves around and is considered broken can't go any lower than that. The only reason it's not going into S is because it's not very relevant in current Gen 9 OU, and I feel like that's kind of significant. Next is Life Orb. I have several opinions on Life Orb, and I don't particularly like this item. I know I'm not the only person that has expressed that. In past gens, I definitely think Life Orb was a lot better. So what changed exactly? Well, simply put, I think it became more and more evident with Hazard Problem constantly chipping away at our HP that a 10% loss in HP isn't worth it when it makes more sense to run Leftovers or Heavy Duty Boots or a choice item, especially when realistically 100% out of every attack. That's not even throwing in potential recoil damages or abilities like Rough Skin and items like Rocky Helmet. A lot of amazing attackers this gen are better off using a booster energy. It puts into perspective its shortcomings. However, in past gens, when for example getting rid of hazards was easier since the most common ghost types weren't so frustrating to go up against, it was honestly a much better item. Additionally, not only was it a good item in past gens, but it's also good in current Little Cup. Not as much as Eviolite, but still good. So I can't rank it that low because of that, therefore I think C is an adequate rating. Very sad to see an iconic item being power crept, honestly. Next is Booster Energy, a new item introduced in this generation. While it doesn't have the same history as like the choice items or leftovers, it's obviously very relevant right now. 3 out of the 10 most used Pokemon are Paradox Pokemon, who are obviously using this item. But yeah, what makes Booster Energy really cool is that you can choose what stat you want to boost in. And it's a very valuable item. What holds it back a little in terms of this tier list is probably the fact that unlike other items discussed in this video, its viability is directly tied to a very specific Pokemon. So in future generations, if these Pokemon aren't available in the next generation or aren't good, this item would fall into obscurity. Also, something I have not mentioned is that while 3 of the top Pokemon that are being used are photosynthesis Pokemon, and yes, they obviously do often use this item, they don't always do this. For example, Great Tusk, besides running Booster Energy, will also run Leftovers or Heavy Duty Boots. Iron Valiant can also run Scarf, and Roaring Moon can run Choice Band. The same thing can be said for other Quake Drive users and photosynthesis Pokemon that aren't in the top 10 or even OU. But because it's still very relevant right now, I will rank it at A. Next is Focus Sash, which in my opinion, similarly to Life Orb, has low-key kind of fallen off. Now there are Focus Sash users like Iron Valiant, Darkrai, Glamora, Deoxys, etc. But it's not like those Pokemon I just mentioned, including Deoxys Speed, the most notable user of it right now, are Pokemon that will always run Sash. For example, Deoxys Speed is also a notable Heavy Duty Boots user, Mental Herb, Light Clay user, etc. this item is less and less used specifically because hazards are not such a problem. It's not worth having Sash on a Pokemon if that item has a high probability of it being wasted because of hazards. In past generation, it did have more viability via Pokemon like Azelf, Aerodactyl, essentially leads that set up Rock and Go Boom. But it's been now 2 generations that boost our dominance, and even before that, I feel like it was still struggling. For example, those exploding leads, while not completely disappearing, were less notable after the explosion of Gen 5. Also, I do understand that explosion leads are not the sole users of Pokesash, but they were the most notable ones in my opinion, because while hazards weren't that bad back then, it was still something that hindered Sash users, which is why I zeroed in on Sash leads. Because obviously, since it's turn 1, they don't have to deal with switching into hazards. So while this might be controversial, it's going in D, unfortunately. Next is Rocky Helmet. Whenever I think of this item, I think of Ferrothorn, the Pokemon that if you touch with your pinky, you die. Besides Pharaoh over the years, Pokemon that have been paired with this item are Garchomp, Skarmory, Corviknight, Tangrowth, and Landorus, and Hippowdon. It was a pretty great item when it was introduced in Gen 5, and it's still good today, because the name of the game is still passive damage. And while you can still use all of these Pokemon in OU Nat decks, you can't use 2 of the most iconic ones, Ferrothorn and Tangrowth, in normal Gen 9 OU. And while it's still very good, it used to be almost the go-to item for some of these Pokemon, except Heavy Duty Boots has kind of taken that spotlight away. But because of the relevancy of U-Turn, Rocky Helmet is still a great item to use to benefit off the popularity of switch moves, which is great when you realize that the Pokemon like Lando, Hippowdon, and Garchomp are immune to the other super popular switch move, Volt Switch. For a game based around switching and predicts, being able to switch in your Garchomp, for example, to a contact move and essentially get chip damage for free is great. On top of that, when you add on possible hazard damage, it's even better. Because of that, it's going to the A tier. Next is Flame Orb. So Flame Orb is an item obviously used by Pokemon with Guts, an ability where if a Pokemon is burned, it ignores the damage that burn usually causes, and it gives the Pokemon an attack boost of 1.5. The opposite of what happens when a Pokemon is burned, obviously. This is an amazing item. The most notable users of it are Ursaluna, currently in OU, and Conkeldurr, currently in UUBL, and Swallow and Machamp, who are both in RU. It's a really great item, but most of the Pokemon who are often paired with Flame Orb aren't very good, quite honestly, and for good reason. I mean, Guts paired with Flame Orb can potentially be very overpowering, and the rest of the Pokemon also rank pretty low. So because of this, Flame Orb can't be ranked as highly because only 15 evolutionary lines have Guts, and only 10 are available in Gen 9. The most relevant Pokemon with this ability isn't underused, so even though this item is in theory great, it hasn't seen enough usage recently for me to rank it B or higher, so I'll rank it C, which isn't bad, it's just not great. Next is Toxic Orb. Flame Orb is more successful older brother. So there's a total of 2 evolutionary lines that have Poison Heal, Burloom and Gliscor, but I'm still going to have to rank it higher. The reason why is because both Burloom and Gliscor, notably Gliscor, has had a significant presence in this and past generation. Burloom was a great Poison Heal user in Gen 4, 5, and 6, where it remained OU, and Gliscor has been a great Poison Heal user in every single generation since Gen 5, and currently in Gen 9 was also banned for some time. Do you guys remember that, by the way? Like, Gliscor was ranked Uber for some time before it was unbanned. I feel like we don't talk about that enough. We just collectively forgot about that. I don't even know what Gen 9 is anymore. But anyways, both of these Pokemon have a great impact. Of course, the item itself is great. Poison Heal is great because it allows you to heal much more HP than you could via Leftovers, and unlike Leftovers, it gets knocked off or tricked, you can benefit from it still, because you're benefiting from the status condition, not the item itself. Plus, that means that you can't get another status condition, so yeah, overall amazing item. So even if only 2 Pokemon in the entire game get it, because of the reasons that I listed, and because those Pokemon were very dominant, I'm going to rate it B. It is at this point that I'm starting to second guess my criteria, but we're too deep into the script. Next is Black Sludge. Black Sludge is honestly an item that kind of elevates the stat poison type by itself, that like Leftovers, heals the user by 1/16 of its HP. Why would anyone run Black Sludge over Leftovers? Well, first, Trick. If a Pokemon, Rotom Wash uses it, Trick would now poison that Pokemon, so that's great. However, one thing that I want to mention is that previously, there was nothing bad about having your poison type running Black Sludge. Now there is, because of Terra. When you change a Pokemon's type, now Black Sludge will hurt them, and you never know when you're gonna need to Terra, so it's sort of unreliable. Because of this, it gets knocked down a little to C. Next is Weakness Policy, an item where if a Pokemon is hit by a super effective move, then the Pokemon attack and special attack is raised by 2 stages. This is cool, but not super practical, because a super effective move can most likely KO or just do way too much damage to the point where it's not worth it if you need that extra boost. And after all, you could just use a boosting move or a choice item if you need a boost in attack. Something cool in theory, but not very realistic, so it gets ranked D. Air Balloon. Air Balloon is good. I can't tell you how many times an Air Balloon Heatran has thrown and wretched in my ways. Many notable Pokemon in Gen 9, including the infamous Goldengo, run Air Balloon. And although it is a one-use item, if used correctly, it can give you a great advantage. In the past, before heavy duty boots, it was nice to give a temporary spikes avoidance. And as this Reddit user pointed out, the great thing about Air Balloon is that lots of Pokemon that are usually good against Air Balloon users usually only run ground type moves like Earthquake, and they don't run anything else, which forces you to switch out. Air Balloon was introduced in Gen 5, and it's relevant 4 generations after, so it's going directly into B, a good tier. Light Clay. Light Clay is an item that extends moves like Light Screen, Reflect, Aurora Veil from 4 turns to 8 turns. It was introduced in Gen 4, and screen abusers can make one of the most infuriating teams to deal with. The famous Light Screen abusers include, but are not limited to, Cresselia, Grimmsnarl, Alola Ninetales, Deoxys Speed, Azelf, and Xatu. This item, along with light screen adjacent moves, have gotten less practical with the addition of Defog being able to clear them. But it's still pretty good at preventing setup sweepers from doing their thing, and it's not like spamming Defog is exactly a very easy thing to do nowadays. But because I wouldn't say there's exactly an overabundance of Pokemon that can set up screens, for example, there are really only 3 great screen Pokemon in OU right now, Grimmsnarl, Ninetales, and Deoxys Speed, it's going into B. Loaded Dice. Loaded Dice is an item introduced in Gen 9, so it doesn't have the history that a lot of the other items have, like fellow Gen 9 item Heavy Duty Boots. But Loaded Dice has been a great, but pretty controversial item. It's one of the reasons Baxcalibur got banned from OU. See, the combo of Bax's Scale Shot with Loaded Dice and Thermal Exchange, so he can be Will-O-Wisp, was too much and was banned to Ubers. And even Loaded Dice was controversial in Uber, as Loaded Dice Scale Shot Koraidon is an absolute menace. And there might be some people, me, that might even call that specific variation of Koraidon the best Pokemon in the tier. Again, very dangerous Pokemon. There are many other Pokemon that are dangerous Loaded Dice users, like Roaring Moon. Loaded Dice has often worked well in hyper offense teams, and has given new life to other Pokemon like Chinchino and Sceptile, who now run it more often. I feel it'll continue to be a relevant item in the future, so it goes straight to B. Next is Quick Claw. Quick Claw was introduced in Gen 2, and even though it's been around for a while, it had not had a lot of impact. Quick Claw gives the user 20% chance of going first in the priority bracket, and of course players aren't going to exactly use it when it's a purely luck-based item, and at the end of the day, 20% is not a lot. If you want a higher chance of going first, then Scarf is a better item. It might not technically have the same use, but it's not a one-time use item, and also it's far more consistent. There's no use having an item that only gives you a 20% chance of going first, so it's going in E. Next is Lumberry. It was introduced in Gen 3, where it was a very important item of that time, where it cures the user of any status conditions, and in those early gens, it was, along with Leftovers, one of the most relevant items. Lumberry had an infinite amount of uses, obviously, but it was loved particularly by physical attackers to avoid being Will-O-Wisped or Thunderwaved and crippled. It was a great way to throw a wrench in your enemy's way when they're trying to stop you from setting up. For example, back in Gen 4, unfortunately for some people, Dracodite and Gyarados often ran Lumberry. You could see it commonly used in an Outrage Mons to avoid confusion. This is back when you could just spam Outrage and Dracos. Nowadays, you can't use that anymore. But back then, it was great. Nowadays, it's not that Lumberry isn't a good item. It still has its uses, but items like, most notably, Boots, have taken the spotlight away from Lum, so you won't see it ran as often because of it, but I still want to rank it highly, so it's going in B. Red Card and Eject Button. Eject Button switches out the holder if it's hit by a damaging move, and I mean, it's alright, I guess. I wouldn't say the Eject Button has ever been downright horrible, but it's also not a super relevant item. I mean, it comes in handy in very specific team structures and strategies. For example, one of the most common Pokemon with the Eject Button is Haydunn, since her role is to reflect hazards, and if a Pokemon chooses to attack, then it can safely switch out. Other Pokemon who could sometimes run it include Iron Treads and or Indeedee. Although it's a good way to get momentum, I wouldn't say it's particularly a great item because even though those Pokemon I named aren't even super likely to run Eject Button, for example, the most common Eject Button user right now, Haydunn, usually will run Leftovers, and Iron Treads is a booster energy type of guy. So I'll rank it D. The other side of the coin is Red Card, which is a better item since it forces its opponent to switch out randomly when your Pokemon is hit, but it's still not great. This item is not that good, for example. Very, very careful to switch in, because of course, if you get hit by the wrong Pokemon, then the item is gone and it was useless, because it's a one-time use item. And while yeah, it's usually used as it's stated for making Pokemon who has set up switch out, if a Pokemon has set up, there's a good chance your Pokemon could just die from its hit. It's still deep. Next is Damp Rock and Heat Rock. Damp Rock is an item that will make rain last longer from 5 to 8 turns. It was introduced in Gen 4 and it was very significant for rain teams. The most common rain setters over the years have been Politoed and Pelipper. Rain teams have existed before Gen 4, but Damp Rock very clearly elevated it. Pretty much the same thing can be said for Heat Rock. was also introduced in Gen 4. The most common Heat Rock Pokemon includes Torkoal and Ninetales, and although I would say Rain has been more consistent than Sun, both have been very important when talking about weather teams. So it's going straight to A. Covercloak. Covercloak is a new item introduced in Gen 9, and it makes it so that you're not affected by the secondary effects of moves. This is honestly a great item, and I'm surprised it doesn't get more used, although it's great for obviously avoiding stat drops in status conditions, but specifically in Gen 9 for a while, players would use it for the short amount of time while players would figure out how to deal with Garganacl and his signature move Salt Cure. I feel the reason that it's not used as often as I thought it would be is number one, in my opinion, you would think that the most common users of this item would be physical attackers trying to avoid Scald Bird, but that's not necessarily as useful anymore because, Scald has been nerfed so severely, so it's not as great as it could have been, and you can still get burned by moves like Will-O-Wisp. On top of that, Leftovers and Heavy Duty Boots are overall more useful in current Gen 9 because, again, hazards are more of a problem now than ever, and Covercloak cannot stop you from getting status condition via other ways, and it will not heal you passively. It's going in C because it's not that great now, but I think it's still a pretty okay item. I hope it's better in the future. C. Citrus Berry. It restores 1/4 of your max HP when you're at half of your HP or less. It was a pretty great item in past generations. It was much more relevant in early gens, but it's still used in recent ones. In early gens, Citrus Berry was used on just about any offensively oriented Pokemon, but nowadays it's used more frequently on Belly Drum users to minimize the damage of the move. Because people don't slap it on Pokemon as often as they did it back in gens like Gen 4, I'm going to rank it in B. Salac Berry. Salac Berry raises the holder speed stat by 1 stage when the user is at 1/4 or less of their HP. And honestly, it was relevant item in early gens. Take a shot every time I say that, but it really fell off. However, when I say early gens, I'm really only referring to Gen 3 OU, where it was used for sweepers. Besides that particularly, it wasn't too common, making this a particularly niche item. The reason Salac Berry was relevant in Gen 3 was because back in Gen 3, the choice items didn't exist, but once choice items were introduced, it was outclassed, very simply put. So it's going into D. Next is Power Herb. Power Herb is a one-time use item that makes moves that take 2 turns take 1. I'd say the most notable Power Herb user is Xerneas plus Geomancy, which is easily the best boosting move of all time. It's a great item in theory, but Power Herb has never been an amazing item when you look at its track record. Besides Geomancy, the most common usage for the Power Herb are Meteor Beam users. It's obviously a rather not optimal that it's a one-use item. Besides that, historically, there's already not that many Meteor Beam users, and the bulk of the ones that exist are not very good. And obviously, if you force to switch out, then the boost from Meteor Beam is gone and that item is rendered useless. Overall, historically, it's never been super relevant apart from the Uber tier. So unfortunately, D. Next is Mental Herb. Mental Herb is a one-time use item that cures the holder of Attract, Disabled Encore, Heal Block, Taunt, and Torment. This item is often used on Pokemon that want to set up hazards and avoid being taunted. The most notable hazard being Sticky Web. The most notable and probably best use of this item being Shuckle, however, isn't great. The reason that Mental Herb is not used as often is because a lot of Pokemon that could use Mental Herb, like web users, usually use Sash because they're very frail, like Ribombee. So this goes in the D tier, which I feel like it might be controversial. I kind of considered it C for a while, but I just don't think it's really been that notable. Next is Expert Belt, which is an item that allows a super effective attacks to do 1.2 times the damage. Just personally, I really like this item. I just think that it's a cool concept, but it really doesn't have a great track record as well, much to my chagrin. It can seem cool to potentially have an Expert Belt on Pokemon with good coverage, and I wouldn't say it's a bad item. It's just that it's niche, again, unfortunately, because it's mainly outclassed by choice items and even Orb, because they're much more consistent and Expert Belt is a bit more situational. So it's going in the C tier. Last but not least, Shed Tail. Shed Tail is an item that allows a Pokemon to escape when trapped by another Pokemon. Shed Tail isn't used that much because trapping abilities like Arena Trap and Shadow Attack are now generally banned, with the exception of Gen 3, because Advanced is just quirky, I guess. And besides that, trapping moves like Magma Storm and Whirlpool aren't exactly rare, no, but just not common enough to dedicate an item slot specifically to. I do want to mention it was more common in past generations, more specifically Skarm would often run it to avoid being trapped by Magnezone, but the fact that the abilities that were the most common reasons to run Shed Tail, Shadow Tag, and Arena Trap are now banned kind of makes this, I wouldn't say obsolete, but just not super popular. Like, it's not like anyone's really running it in current gen, I know you, so D. This is my final tier list. I think it's okay, maybe a little controversial, but just don't stare at it too much.